Hello and welcome to this pygame tutorial where we'll be making a title screen, we'll be making some buttons and generally handling some game flow. So I'll start by showing you what we plan to build. And here you can see the title screen. We've got a quit button which closes the pygame application. We've got a start button which takes us to the first level, and we have another button here which takes us to each next level. These buttons are responsive, so when you hover over them they increase in size, and that's what we're going to do today. So I've got a fresh Python file called menu.py that we're going to work on. One of the reasons I wanted to do this is because pygame doesn't come with any sort of help for building user interface components at all, so you have to build everything from scratch. There's a few libraries that you can use, third-party libraries. They seem to, some of them are still in development, many of them have sort of finished up and aren't in development anymore. And if you use one of those, you need to follow whatever paradigm they use, which might not fit with what you want. So I wanted to build something myself, and I learned a bit about pygame while I was doing it that I didn't already know, and I just thought other people might find it helpful to do the same sort of thing. So anyway, let's get started. I'll be doing this tutorial in 4 videos. I think there'll be 4 different steps. Hopefully each video will be relatively short. Yeah, right, okay, let's just get going. So at the head of the file, you're going to need some imports. We're going to need pygame. I'm going to need, and then it's just a bit easier to do a couple of specific sections of pygame as well, can make it a bit cleaner. So we're going to use the free type module, which helps us write text in pygame. And then also just specifically import the sprite class and the rect class from Python. Oh, sorry, it should be like that. You might notice I'm using Visual Studio Code here, but I mean obviously you can use whatever your favourite text editor is, or IDE. I'm going to add in a couple of colours as well that we're going to reuse, and this just means we don't have to keep hard coding in our colours. Oh, also I'll just mention this while I'm doing this, that all the code for this is available on my blog, which I will put a link to in the description. It's programmingpixels.com. So if you prefer to follow a text written tutorial than a video, then yeah, you can click the link below, and basically I go over the same thing but in text form. If you prefer to watch a video, obviously just keep watching. Sorry, I'm going to write now a function which just creates a pygame surface with some text written on it. It's just a helper function. It's just going to help us out with our buttons. So the first step really is to get some buttons on the screen, and we'll worry about the game flow in a later step. So we'll need the text that we actually want to write, and then a couple of details about the text, like the font size. We will need the colour, and also the background colour of the surface. So this isn't the text colour, it's the colour behind the text. Let's see. So then we need to create the font. So there is another way you can make text in pygame, but I think from my research it turns out that free type is the better way to go. It's the simpler way. I think there's just pygame.fonts is another way you can do it. But using free type, we can save a couple of lines. I think we're just going to make a courier font object here with the font size that we pass into the function, sorry. We're going to make it bold as well, just because it's a bit easier to see. I prefer it bold, but Obviously, if you guys want to experiment a bit, you can change the font size to other system fonts you might be able to find. So Arial is a pretty solid one that every system is going to have. I'm sure there are others. And yeah, you can obviously change the bold as well and pass in a different font size to I'm going to. So then we're going to use the font.render function where we need to pass in what the text is going to be. Here they've got a foreground colour, which is actually our text, RGB, and then they've got a background colour. That's the other reason to use the free type module here in pygame, is it makes it very easy to return a surface in this way. And what we're going to do is later draw this text surface onto a display surface. And then we need our background RGB. And of course, so this returns a surface object and I think a rect object, but we're not actually going to use the rect object, we just want the surface for now. Okay, and finally we're just going to actually return that surface object, and I'm going to convert it before we do. So there's a couple of convert functions in pygame that convert surfaces so they're more easily drawn. They're faster to draw, faster to blit. And there's not really a lot of clear documentation about when you should and shouldn't use them. So somebody did suggest to me that you don't need to call them on surfaces in this way, only on surfaces that you make from images. But there's nothing really in the documentation to suggest that that's the case, and there's no harm in calling it anyway, so I'm just going to convert it before I pass that back. Okay, so now let's try and make actually our button element. I'm actually going to call it a UI element, just because we might want to extend it later, make it a bit more interesting, something like that. What I'm going to do as well is I'm actually going to make it a subclass of the sprite, the Python sprite class. And the reason I'm going to do that is because pygame offers a lot of helper methods and helper classes when you're dealing with their sprite methods. And so by subclassing it, we're going to be able to make use of those later if we want to. And I'm going to begin actually by, I'm not really going to use all the features that the sprite class offers. We'll build up to it. So I'm talking about the things like render classes here that Python offers, and it makes it a bit easier if you've got you can make a collection of sprites and then render them all in a single method call. Anyway, we need to add a def. Add a function, an initialization function here. We are going to use this as an instance class. So we need self. We want to have a center location, center position, using the center of this sprite as the anchor point for our text. We need to know what actual text to display. This needs a font size, and it also needs a background color and a text color. Okay. So one of the features is that when we want to know when the mouse is over, and we're actually going to change the image size based on that. So we want to have an instance variable which stores information about whether or not the mouse is over the element. And then we're going to sort of preload the two different images we need. So we only need two images, one for when the mouse isn't over and one for when the mouse is over. So when the mouse isn't over, I'm going to call that the default image. So we create the surface with text. This is our helper function just right above here. And then we pass in text. We pass in font size. And we pass in text RGB and the background RGB. Okay. And then we need another image, because we need a separate image when the mouse is over. And I'm going to call this the highlighted image. You know, like you've highlighted the button by putting your mouse over it. And I'm just going to copy the created surface with text. And we're going to make this a little bit bigger, I think. 1.2 times the size. That should be enough. And then just a few other little things. So the reason we're adding those to a list is because internally the pygame sprite class actually uses these two properties, and one's called image, and the other is rect. So a rect is the top left location of an image, and then its width and height. So that's everything you need to draw a rectangle, and then the image is, you know, the actual the pixel data and colors of each pixel, so how to actually draw the image. Whereas the rect, is sort of where, and then the width and height, the space it takes up. And by making our list of images, we're later going to make it easy to swap this self.image property and a self.rect property of our UI element that's a subclass of sprite. But anyway, we'll come back to that later. If it's not clear now, it'll be clear in a little while, very short while. Okay, so how are we going to get these rects? We want to do default image dot get rect, and we just also have to, in this get rect, provide a center location, center position. So this is something we're passing in. When we create our button element, we're setting the anchor point as a center position, and that's what we're doing here. To make our rect, we're just passing in that information about where we want our button to appear. Center position again. Okay, that's a pretty long line. I think we'll just break this up a bit like that. There we go. That looks a bit better. Oh, and one other thing we need to do, which I'll just put at the top because I think it's maybe a bit better up there, is we need to call the init function of the sprite base class, which we can do in Python like this. And all that's doing, that's just calling the initialization function of sprite. Okay, a little more to do. So I did talk about these image and rects lists and how we're going to use them, and we'll handle that now. We're actually going to make a property. We're going to call it image, and we're going to return the second image in the list if mouse over is true. Otherwise, we're going to return the default one. So hopefully that's clear. So self.image1 is this one, the highlighted image here. And we do that when self mouse over is true. At the moment it's always going to be false, but we will change this variable later, depending on whether the mouse is over or not. And otherwise we'll be returning the first element of the list, which is just the default one here, default image. And we're going to do essentially the same thing with the rect property. Okay, if we just copy this line, it might be slightly faster. Rect. Okay. We're nearly done with the class. We just want to do something to check whether or not the mouse is over it. So we're going to have an update function which takes a mouse position. The helper functions that pygame provides, one of the helper classes I should say, is renderers. And if you add lots of buttons, say, to a renderer collection, you can then call update as a single method call, and it'll update all of your buttons. and that's why we're using an update function here. So that later we don't need to sort of iterate through all our buttons. We can just use a collection. I'm not sure if collection is the right word for the renderers. They store a collection of items. I guess the renderers are renderers and they have a collection of items within them. That might be more correct to say, but I think you get the idea. Anyway, sorry, we need to just check whether or not our mouse pointer is colliding with our rect. And pygame has a helpful function for this, just self.rect.collide collide point, and then we pass in our mouse position, and if that's true then we set mouse over to be true. We could do this in a single line, by the way. We could have mouse over equals self.rect.collide.point, and that's saying whether or not our current rect property, whether or not our mouse position is colliding with whatever our current rect is. Yes, so we could do this in a single line, but we need to come back and change it a little later, so I'm just going to do it like this, and then it's sort of quite clear as well, even if it is a few more lines. One final thing, this class is getting pretty big, but we do need to add a draw function, and this just means that the class itself knows how to draw itself on a surface. It means we don't have to sort of tell it how to do that. It's quite straightforward. We're going to use surface.blip, which if you've done any pygame before you should be familiar with. It just draws a particular image onto a particular surface. In this case I think we're always going to pass in our screen object, which is the surface, and then we're going to draw, there we go, our image property onto, our image property, and then we pass in the rect because the rect has the location information as well as the width and height. Okay, so that rounds up our user interface class, user interface element class. Now we're just going to write a quick main function to test it out. So, def main. We need to init pygame, which you always need to do. We're going to create a screen, create a display surface, and set it to this variable screen. So that's pygame.display.setMode. And I think if we just do 800 by 600, we'll just have it in a window. It'll make it clear. And one of the things about pygame is if you start using full screens when you're testing stuff out, and you accidentally create a loop you can't get out of or something like that, you just get trapped. It can be a real nightmare, and you just got to push the off button on your computer. It can be really difficult to get out. Might be a bit easier in Windows. Maybe that it's a bit stronger, the task management in there, but on Linux you're just trapped. Anyway, sorry, we're going to create our user interface element. So we need a center position location. I'm going to write all this out in full just so it's super clear, because we've got 5 arguments that go in here and I don't want it to just look like magic numbers everywhere. So we'll put it we'll put our button, this first test button, somewhere in the center of our screen. Let's say 400 400. So I'll get rid of this. The next argument is font size, and 30 should be fine. And then, so it's my Visual Studio Code is trying to be helpful by telling me which arguments I need for this class, but it's actually more distracting than it is helpful when I'm trying to explain what I'm doing. So sorry, we need a background color. That's what we're going to use our blue for. Do you remember at the beginning we sort of just have these blue and white at the top? They're the only 2 colors we're going to use. We're going to keep it simple. So we'll set the background as blue, and then what our text color we'll have as white. Sorry. And finally we need to actually put in some text, and this is just going to be hello world for now because, you know, fan favorite. Don't want to disappoint the crowd. Okay, so we've created a button, we've created a screen, we've initialized pygame. I think we just need to make our loop, our main loop. We need to You always need to clear the event queue in pygame, even if you're not using any of the elements of it. Oops, that was right, sorry. And I don't think there's a better way than just enumerating through and calling the get method. So every mouse movement you move, every button push you make in pygame adds events to the pygame event queue. And yeah, if you don't clear them, they just build up and up and up, and you can eventually sort of get a crash just from having the event queue be too large. So you do need to remember to clear it. And then we're just going to call screen.fill blue. Whoops. Blue. So that draws our base colour. And then we're going to update our UI element. And remember, we need to pass in mouse position up here to our update. So, yep, sorry, pygame.mouse. Pygame.mouse.get get position. Yep, there we go. That's the function that gets the mouse position. So we update it, and then remember we wrote a function so it knows how to draw itself here. Draw. So we call draw, and we need to pass in our drawing surface, which is the screen here. And finally, we need to, very important this, otherwise we just have a black screen. We need to call flip on our display. So pygame.display.flip flips the buffer and draws, updates the screen. So we actually have these elements now. And very important as well, we actually need to call this main function, which we can just get the bottom like this here. We save it, and then down here I'm going to call Python menu. Just before I do this, there's not a lot of requirements, not a lot of modules or anything that we're using here. We're just using pygame, so we do need to just make sure we do pip install pygame. In this case, I already have it, so I don't need to install it. But if you're following along and you don't have pygame in your environment, in your Python environment, then you do need to remember to install it. Otherwise, you'll get an error. We called it menu. Oh, I'm not in the right location. Hang on. Okay, sorry. I think I'm in the right location now. So yeah, I think Python menu. There we are. Ah, we've got an error. So let's have a look at that. I see. It's not. I just need center, don't I? Because they didn't match. So I need center and center. I think that's right. Let's give that another go. Ah, there we go. Right. Okay, so we've got our button in roughly the center. Well, so roughly the center. It's not really in the center, the y-axis, but it is centered, centered this way. And yep, if we hover over it, it does increase in size. So that's not too bad. That's 70-ish lines of code. Might be able to cut that down a bit if you wanted to for some reason. You know, this was obviously taking up 5 or 7 lines there anyway. Yep, 7. And it could be 1 if you wanted to make a mess of your code. But what we don't have is this doing anything. We've got a responsive button in that it responds to mouse overs, but it doesn't actually do anything else. So that wraps up this part. In the next part, we'll make that button responsive, actually respond to clicks. I've put a link to my blog in the description below, so you can check that out. Not every blog post I do becomes a video, but every video I do does have a corresponding blog post that's written up. And you can follow me on the usual channels, Twitter and stuff like that. Sign up to the mailing list for the blog if you're interested. Otherwise, hopefully I'll see you back for part 2.